We were talking about how social media is being used. Let's speak to Craanen, a senior research and policy manager on extremism at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue think tank. The ISD, as they're known, look to safeguard human rights and reverse the rising tide of extremism and disinformation worldwide. Thank you for joining us on BBC News. And have you been surprised how social media has been used in this violent disorder over the last week?
I think not necessarily surprised, but what I am surprised at is kind of the relationship between what we've seen online and the offline violence. So oftentimes it can be very hard to assess whether online content leads directly to offline violence. And I would say in this instance, it was incredibly clear. And that was kind of seen from following the attack. So last Monday, where a 17-year-old perpetrator killed 3 girls and injured many others. We saw an immense amount of disinformation very quickly spreading about the supposed perpetrator, him being an alleged migrant who came to the UK recently and illegally. And from that, we saw a lot of hate speech, mostly anti-migrant and anti-Muslim hate speech, but also very quickly these calls for protest. And this really started with the focus on Southport, but obviously we've seen them all over the country, and we've seen that sort of those online sort of, calls for protest. That's exactly where the violence actually manifested itself. So I'm surprised at how direct the relationship is and how clear it is.
And I suppose the problem for the authorities is there isn't one specific organiser of this disorder.
No, exactly. And that's the very hard part. And I think that's very also characteristic to the far right. So the far right, I think, for anyone sort of watching the far right over the last years, I don't think, to be honest, this comes as a surprise. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Obviously, the scale is immense, but given the anti-migrant and anti-Muslim hatred that has been spreading, but also that has been mainstreamed for so many years, that has sort of given the far right a more confident outlook, and to think that they could maybe get away with this. And the scale of the violence and the extremist violence, I should say, is of a very different scale that we've seen it recently. And it will be very hard for the police to kind of see, who's involved. And obviously a lot of arrests have been made, but especially towards the online content with the Online Safety Act. Whilst there are now offences being or have been added to the Online Safety Act for spreading disinformation, for instance, how are they going to find those people and hold them accountable for what they've done also in the online sphere?
Yes, on that point, the government saying that they would like the social media companies to do more to tackle that. But then you have Elon Musk, the head of X, tweeting that civil war is inevitable in the UK. It is very hard for the government to hold the social media companies to account over the spread of disinformation.
Definitely. And I think, where tech companies could kind of do more, I think it's kind of a two-pronged approach also in terms of the government holding tech companies to account. But first of all, tech companies have their own terms of service, which is basically the platform rules about what is allowed on the platform and what is not allowed on the platform. And what we've seen with Southport and sort of the accompanying violence is that these terms of service have not been enforced adequately. So, for example, when the police was saying that, that the name was false and that it was disinformation, what platforms could have done, and which is kind of in their terms of service when fighting mis or disinformation, is to raise sort of those credible voices. So, for example, that police message that it was false. What we saw was actually the opposite of that. So we saw, far-right ideologues and users spreading disinformation, and disinformation itself being algorithmically amplified and brought to users' feeds. So I think, first of all, making sure that platforms actually enforce their own terms of service is very important. On the other hand, sort of the second point, with the Online Safety Act, I think rightfully so, it focuses on sort of the risks that platforms have. So what are the features that might lead people to be exposed to harmful content? And that risk-based approach is something I really think that we should focus on more. Given that we're not really going to remove our way out of this. We can't remove all the content, but there are a host of tools that tech companies have now that the government has to make sure that that is enforced.
Craanen from the extremism research at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue think tank. Thank you very much for your time.